I want to thank the President of Azerbaijan and co-chairs Vera and Dr. Ismail and Secretary General Rovshan for your leadership and your humanity. And though I'm geographically at a distance, indeed far away, I feel very close to the work for justice that NGIC is doing. NGIC has a special role to play in healing our fractured world. For even amidst war and weighed down by conflict, we must strive for peace. Even when there is division, we must work for dialogue. And even in tragic circumstances where nations are violently pushed apart, we must attempt to bring them together. And yes, even when old bridges are being blown up, we at NGIC must try to build bridges anew together. Friends, we must never act from fear, but we must never fear to act. And if anyone is in any doubt about the strength and depths of support for the people of Ukraine, I say without equivocation, let them come to Baku this week. At this great event, bringing together national leaders and the leadership of international institutions, from the well-respected head of the WHO to the equally well-respected head of the WTO, let the world see and hear it firsthand, our united admiration for the courage of the people of Ukraine. Courage, you know, is the greatest quality of all, for upon it all else depends. You can be eloquent, intelligent, innovative, creative, kind, and generous, but without courage, nothing is possible. Lives have been broken, but the spirit of Ukraine is unbreakable. Buildings and homes have been destroyed, but the unity of the people of Ukraine is indestructible. Invading armies may conquer land and territory in Ukraine, but they will never conquer the hearts and minds of the people of Ukraine. And we have a moral responsibility to do more in aid of both Ukraine and justice. For none of us can be at ease when Ukraine is ill at ease. None of us live in comfort when millions of displaced Ukrainians live without any comfort. None of us can ever be content again when murder, rape, and intimidation are the cause of such heartfelt discontent. And so we owe it not just to Ukraine, but to the cause of a civilized world, to not only extend sanctions and travel bans, and not just to step up the supply of weapons and humanitarian aid, but to promise in the clearest, most unequivocal way possible, we will never tolerate or acquiesce in one country replacing the rule of law by the use of force against another country. And so we will bring to justice those who have committed war crimes. And while the International Criminal Court takes evidence of crimes against humanity, the quickest and cleanest way to indict those responsible is to arraign them before the Special War Crimes Tribunal that the Ukraine government has requested, modeled on the trials of Nuremberg of 1946, for the initial crime, the foundational crime, obvious to the world, the crime of aggression, one country against another. And then the message will go out and reverberate across the world that never again will aggression triumph over peaceful negotiation. Never again will law-breaking replace the rule of law. Never again will impunity reign when injustice is done. Friends, for 2 years, disease threatened the world. Now in 2022, with COVID still present, it is not only war, but famine that now threatens us all. 800 million of our fellow global citizens without enough food to avoid going hungry. 300 million, according to the World Food Programme, under direct threat of starvation. And all this layered on top of COVID, a new energy crisis, a new debt crisis, depreciating currencies in many countries, and the droughts, the heat waves, the floods, and the melting of ice that climate change brings. Multiple crises. Already 100 million people displaced, looking for homes they do not now have, and 60% of low-income countries in debt distress. And for the first time, I remember, with oil prices soaring and food prices surging, the majority of the world's population seeing their standards of living fall. Now, in desperate times, after the Second World War, came the Marshall Plan, which reconstructed a war-ravaged Europe. An oil shock in the 1970s brought the creation of the G7 and a commitment to manage global currencies. Out of the global financial crisis of 2008, a new G20 leaders group agreed on a $1 trillion economic stimulus to end the threat of depression. But now, in the face of this global polycrisis, the G20 seems more like the G0. And we seem on the way to a one world, two systems future. And as a result, a leaderless world. Churchill, one of my predecessors as UK Prime Minister, summed it up in another recession-hit, protectionist, jingoistic, and conflict-ridden decade, when he said of the 1930s, as he might say now, that we were resolved to be irresolute, adamant for drift, solid for fluidity, and all-powerful for impotence. We know we are at the mercy of three seismic global shifts that are moving us from one area that is gone to another, from a unipolar to multipolar world, from hyper-globalization to globalization light, from the neoliberal Washington consensus, not even supported now in Washington, where economics dictated political decisions, to now today, politics dictating economic decisions. And we cannot afford to sleepwalk through this dangerous decade. We have to understand that 82 countries continue to be defenders and abstainers, and thus enablers of the violation of human rights in Ukraine. And a far larger catalogue, 155 strong, including the whole of Africa and Asia, and most of Latin America and the Middle East, have refused to impose sanctions. We have NATO unity, but still global disunity. But these countries are not walking away from the West for the love of an aggressor or aggression. While they highlight double standards, Western concern for Ukraine, but lack of concern for those affected by conflicts in the South, the biggest grievance is that a Western-led globalization has failed to deliver for the citizens and appears more like a runaway train that is careered out of control and seems uncontrollable. Parallel crises make the future perilous, but we are not powerless. Even amidst war, we have to prepare for the greatest peacetime task of all, to rebuild our post-1945 international institution for today's world. The first test, whether we can come together as a G20 or under the United Nations to deal with the energy, food, debt, currency, and continuing COVID and climate change crises, which cannot be dealt with in isolation, for all are hitting every country at once, but can only be dealt with as part of a comprehensive plan to deal with the biggest enemy of all: poverty, deprivation, starvation, squalor, pollution, and inequality. An agenda that repositions the IMF, too narrowly defined today as the safety net for countries in trouble, as responsible for the surveillance of the whole world economy, could advance recovery and growth in both developed and developing countries. Recapitalizing the World Bank, now seen principally as the advisor to the poor, to become the delivery agent for global public goods, and in partnership with the United Nations, the financier of humanitarian aid, could demonstrate that our institutions can now cope with today's global emergencies. In such a renewal and reform of the global architecture, the World Trade Organization would be empowered to be the scourge of beggar thy neighbor protectionism. Working together, the UN and the COP processes could deliver a concerted and properly coordinated push to net carbon zero as quickly as possible, and an enhanced G20 that finally included the developing world in a bigger way would achieve the representativeness and thus the legitimacy it needs to be effective as the premier decision-making forum for the global economy. Narrow adversarial nationalism can be defeated once we understand that in this new world, every country's independence is limited by its interdependence. But realizing that imperative will require us to make a case for the alternative future that balances the patriotism each nation values with the cross-border cooperation each nation needs. Let us recognize that peace does not happen by accident, but has to be won by never-ending vigilance, effort, and determination. That prosperity, to be sustained, has to be shared. And international cooperation, murdered by those who would fight wars, has to be reborn. And here in Baku is the place that we can start. Thank you very much.